This is CBS Eye on the World. I'm John Batchelor. It is the spring of 1885. The 22nd President of the United States, Grover Cleveland, former governor of New York, former mayor of Buffalo, former district attorney of Erie County, enters the White House, enters the chief executive's office with a vision of how he will conduct himself. That is the beginning of the policy disputes that will reign over his first term, and then, with the in-between period, his second term. This is the only man to hold the office twice, so effectively he is the 22nd and 24th president. I learned this from a wonderful new book, rich with irony, A Man of Iron, The Turbulent Life and the Improbable Presidency of Grover Cleveland. Troy Senik is the author. I welcome Troy, I congratulate him, and I begin with the policies of spring of 1885. Troy, the president is faced with stories of silver and gold, stories of tariff reform, stories of civil service reform. It's all quite overwhelming for us now to imagine how Congress is going to deal with these. But the chief executive had a style that was quite different from other presidents before him. He had no experience in the federal city. He had no experience at the national level. He was a man who had very effectively used the veto when he was governor of New York, the veto when he was mayor of Buffalo. How did he regard himself? What was his mission in his mind as he took on the Congress, the willful Congress dominated by lords? Good evening to you.
Good evening, John. It's a delight to be with you. The answer to that question, Grover Cleveland is a man who takes the verb preside very seriously in presidency. This is a guy who, as you suggest, had used the veto very aggressively as mayor of Buffalo, had used the veto very aggressively as governor of New York. And his conception of the presidency and of presidential power, especially in his first term, is in many ways negative in nature. I say in the book that Cleveland kind of sees himself as a kind of ombudsman in chief, right? This is a guy who thinks that the responsibility that comes with heading the executive branch is really to keep the legislative branch in check. It's just as important to stop the depredations of Congress as it is to have any sort of affirmative executive agenda. And so that is a constant that you see throughout both of Cleveland's terms, although, and I'm sure we'll get to this later, in his second term, he does evolve a bit. He does begin to look a bit more like a modern president. It takes the lead, is a little more aggressive, a little more often. But Cleveland, and this is one of the reasons that he is so beloved by many libertarians today, many limited government conservatives, is a guy who really takes the negative power of the presidency seriously. And as a result, he vetoes 414 pieces of legislation in his first term, which is more than all 21 of his predecessors combined. So this is a pretty central element of the presidential style of Grover Cleveland.
Let's touch on some of the policy issues, because he's always on the righteous side, and that puts him up against the influence peddling, sometimes known as Congress. Okay, tariffs. We also think of it as protectionism. What was his opinion as he came into office?
Cleveland had not dealt with this issue very much in lower office. He's relatively new to it when he comes to office, but he very quickly comes to the conclusion that tariff rates need to be reduced. If this sounds strange that this would be so central to the president of the United States, it's important to understand that in the late 19th century, tariffs were where the money was, where the revenue was for the federal government. We don't have an income tax at this time. The vast majority of the federal government's money is coming from tariffs. Your only other sources are excise taxes, selling land in the West occasionally. But Cleveland's conception of the tariff issue is interesting because it is sort of the opposite of how tariffs usually get talked about today, by which I mean Cleveland's position was that lowering tariffs was the populist stance. And the reason that he thought this was because he looked at the tariff system as it existed and saw that the companies that got the tariffs to protect their business interests were the ones who had the most influence in Washington, were the ones who could get to the member of the House or the Senate to give them that sort of special protection. So Cleveland thought, if I'm lowering tariffs, I am reducing the sort of corporate government collusion at the same time that I'm keeping prices low for Americans in their capacity as consumers. So his conception of this, very much the opposite of the way we tend to talk about tariffs today.
Civil service. Didn't Grover Cleveland know the job of a president is to hand out patronage to his own party? Was that a complete surprise to him?
It seems to have been a bit. I mean, I'm sure we'll touch on this multiple times throughout this conversation, but there is a righteousness born out of his religious upbringing that you see consistently throughout Grover Cleveland's life. And look, up until this moment in the 1880s, this is not a system that a lot of people object to too strenuously, right? I mean, there is a conceit throughout the middle of 19th century politics that this is just sort of how you do politics. Your party wins the White House. You hand out a bunch of government jobs. Some of them will be done well. Some of them will be done okay. Some of them probably be terrible, but that's the price of doing business. That's how you keep a party together. And Cleveland objects to this system. And he comes to office with the idea that, look, if there are Republicans who are in office who are doing these jobs well, I will keep them. If there are Democrats who do them well, I will put them in office. But he is really sort of blowing up the edifice of how executive branch politics is done in the 19th century. It is like a lot of the issues that he deals with in his first term. I spend a lot of time in the book trying to situate it in the context of the time because these seem so exotic. These are not things that we talk about anymore. If we talk about civil service protections today, it's usually on the opposite end of the spectrum. It's the idea that government employees are too hard to fire. And Cleveland really is sort of upending the way that business has been done here. And it's worth noting, this is the first time the Democrats have won the White House since 1856, when he comes in 1884. So the idea that he's going to keep some qualified Republicans in government positions does not go down well with the more partisan members of the Democratic Party. And this is the first of many fights that he's going to have with members of his own party throughout his administration.
He keeps two famous men on in their jobs as he inherits from the previous administration. The Recorder of Deeds, Frederick Douglass, and Theodore Roosevelt, the civil service reform agent. Chester Arthur signed civil service reform despite his instincts. And TR is making his way towards the presidency with his thinking about cleaner government. Good for Cleveland to get credit for them, but he also at the same time was taking on the Grand Army of the Republic. Grand Army of the Republic we associate today with Frederick Douglass, who was a friend of Abraham Lincoln's, and Teddy Roosevelt entirely because he, as a young man, watched Lincoln's funeral through the streets of New York. Taking on the G.A.R., what did that mean to Cleveland? Why did he take that risk of rejecting all those pensions?
So the context for this is that when you're coming out of the Civil War, the start of Cleveland's presidency, you're 2 decades removed from this, right? And there is a system by which Union veterans, disabled Union veterans, have claim to government pensions. Cleveland has no objection to this system, but Cleveland is a real green eye shades guy. I mean, he cares about not spending a cent beyond what the government needs to spend. But there's also a moral principle at work here. Cleveland starts vetoing lots and lots of these pensions because he sees a clear pattern of many of them being fraudulent, people making claims that they wouldn't be eligible for. And the Republicans in Congress basically using this as a kind of constituency building, right? It is not dissimilar from the way earmarks were used, in that you get a couple people from your district who want a pension. They maybe have a colorable case for it. And you just push it through. And the next time the guy who votes for this one will vote for yours, and so on and so forth. Cleveland regards it as a serious moral principle at stake, by which I mean his problem here, and the reason that he is willing to risk the wrath of the G.A.R., which is the Union Veterans Organization, is because he thinks it's actually so significant, so important, that people who really did stand up in an hour of maximum peril and put their lives on the line for the sake of union, that they be alone on the pension rolls, not that they be side by side with these people who've just learned how to game the system. He thinks that that's a betrayal, not only of the taxpayers, but of the people who actually made the sacrifices, to be indifferent as to whether somebody gets this for having taken a huge risk on behalf of their country versus whether they got it just because they figured out how to get some money out of Washington.
Doesn't sound like a politician, doesn't he? Does he? A man of iron. The turbulent life and improbable presidency of Grover Cleveland. Where did he come from? New England. Born 1837, a preacher's kid. Richard Cleveland, his father, a Yale graduate, a Princeton Seminary graduate. His mother, Anne, a German Quaker. He grows up working hard, self-discipline, all of the templates associated with the Protestant Reformation. At the same time, his family meets some hard times. His father doesn't earn very much money, and he travels from roost to roost. His health is broken at one point, and the money has to be cut back. Early on, Grover Cleveland had a sense of duty to his family, to his mother, to his father, to his siblings. Was that true for the whole family? Were these all hardworking young people?
To the extent that we have records, that does seem to be the case. I mean, it's a big family. Cleveland is the middle of 9 children. So even Cleveland himself, interestingly enough, as a president of the United States, we have a pretty thin record of what his childhood was like. And we see, as you suggest, these glimpses of this deep sense of duty that's in him. But it was a pretty austere, pretty religious upbringing, and they all seem to have had this deep work ethic, this deep sense of charity as well. I mean, Cleveland ends up, his father dies by the time he's 16. Cleveland himself is denied the ability to go to college because of this. But as he moves into his adult life and starts making a decent salary, he's not keeping most of it. I mean, most of it is actually being funneled back to the support of his widowed mother and the education of his younger siblings. And that kind of character, as I say, to the extent that we glean it from the other siblings, does seem to be sort of a constant throughout the family. And by the way, interestingly enough, kind of a constant of future generations of Clevelands. We sort of see this in all of them.
Grover Cleveland begins his life as a clerk at 19, living above the store, and he will continue his education without college, self-taught. At one point, he does a year in New York at the College of the Blind. Was it the School of the Blind, teaching grammar?
That's right. This is just shortly after his father dies. This is the first time that he's really called upon to provide for the family financially. He and his brother go to Manhattan, Cleveland only for a year, teaching in this school. And he regards it as a pretty miserable experience, partially because he doesn't really care for the way that the students are treated. As I suggest in the book, all the accounts of this institution suggest that it probably resembled something more like what we now think of as an asylum than as a school. And he leaves there, I'm sure, compounded by the fact that, he's still dealing with the emotional fallout of his father's death. But he leaves there after only a year and returns to upstate New York.
He has a beneficiary. It's the man who is married to one of his mother's sisters. And he heads towards Cleveland, but stops off in Buffalo and really never gets back on the train again. His choice of Buffalo is accidental, on purpose. How do you regard it now, Troy?
Accidental and serendipitous is, I think, the way that I'd characterize it. As you suggest, he was headed for Cleveland. Buffalo was something he was treating as a way station along the way. And the man that you're referring to, Lewis Allen, who was his uncle by marriage, saw something in his nephew. I don't think saw a future president of the United States. I don't think it ran to that extent. And realized that Grover Cleveland didn't really have much of a plan for what he was going to do. If he went to Ohio, he had an ambition, not really a politician's ambition, but he clearly wanted to make something of himself. And in Buffalo, by his uncle's reckoning, there was at least an infrastructure around him. There was family. They could place him, because his uncle was connected, in the right places. And in fact, the place that he gets him is in the law firm that begins Grover Cleveland's ascent through the legal establishment in Buffalo.
Yes, the way he became a lawyer at this time, Troy reminds us, is you apprentice. There were very few law schools.
Right.
Quickly, onto the district attorney's office. He becomes an assistant district attorney. He works 8 a.m. to 3 a.m. He works very hard, always from early on. He will eventually become the district attorney of Erie County as a young man. Why did they like him? What qualities did they celebrate giving him these posts?
Well, that work ethic was a big part of it, because when he is assistant district attorney, he never actually reaches district attorney, by the way. He runs for it and loses. Assistant district attorney, which is an appointed position, he gets that because he's a young man with a big work ethic, and he is deeply reliable, because the actual district attorney at the time was older, in poor health, and didn't live particularly near where the job was being done. And this is a trend that you sort of see throughout Grover Cleveland's early career. Nobody is pointing to this young man and saying, oh, there's this brilliance that we have to tap into, that we have to give a platform somewhere. It's usually he's the guy who will do the work when nobody else wants to do it. And it turns out, even though we have no evidence that he is doing that strategically, that it serves a great strategic purpose for him, because it ends up placing him in a series of locations in a business sense that he otherwise never would have been in, because Grover, he may not be spectacular, but he's reliable.
He becomes sheriff, not district attorney.
That's right. Yeah.
And that gives him the very important detail that he's also the hangman. And that weighs on his soul, but he does his duty. He doesn't hand it off. He doesn't hire somebody to do it for him. He's now established a reputation in Buffalo that we will see in that first part of his administration in the White House. He's stubborn, he's willful, he's righteous. Did Buffalo need that? Did they celebrate it at the time?
Buffalo needed it. By the time he becomes mayor, which is about 10 years removed from when he's sheriff, there's a long interregnum there where he's back in private practice. It's very popular in Buffalo. But before we get to that point where Cleveland is appealing sort of directly to the voters,
we have about a minute, Troy. Go ahead.
Okay, there is the issue of how this plays within the Democratic Party. And the Democratic Party in Buffalo is not always thrilled, because Cleveland does things like measuring all the deliveries that come to the sheriff's office to make sure there's no graft, no kickbacks. So he is not the most popular guy within the party, because this sense of righteousness is impeding business as usual.
Troy, Senik is the author. The book is A Man of Iron, The Turbulent Life and Improbable underline Presidency of Grover Cleveland. Grover Cleveland was 3 times a candidate for the presidency. He won the popular vote all 3 times, but the second time he lost in the Electoral College. Why did he lose? Why is a man who's been celebrated his whole life as Troy writes, he's not for turning, which we say of Margaret Thatcher, we say that of Grover Cleveland. Why was he rejected in the election of 1888? We go immediately to the policies that dominate the conversation. We've mentioned the Grand Army of the Republic rebuking Grover Cleveland for not handing out the pensions that are brought by senators and congressmen as a form of, well, the graft is too strong a word, favors. However, we come to his thinking about America as the frontier is closing. And I want to start there because you mentioned, Troy, that he denounces Geronimo as a murderous savage. I thought, Geronimo in Grover Cleveland's life? Good heavens. What was Grover Cleveland's opinion for the least among us, the Native Americans and the African Americans, and also for the people who were homesteading in America? Let's begin with the Native Americans, the indigenous people. What was his attitude about their challenges?
He has what we would now regard as a fairly righteous attitude about the way that Native Americans have been mistreated by the federal government. He singles them out in his inaugural address and reproaches the country for the way that they've been treated in the past. And he makes one of the objectives of his first term trying to set Native Americans on better footing. The practical implications of this is he signed something known as the Dawes Act. And the idea here is that Cleveland thinks, as the frontier is closing, that it is unsustainable to continue this sort of one country, two systems model where you've got the United States moving ever westward, but Native Americans confined to the reservation system. And he is trying to put them on a footing where they can embrace private property, where they can become American citizens, where they can have voting rights. It is very well intentioned, but there is many a slip twixt the cup and the lip here. And over the years, during Cleveland's terms and afterwards, we will see these policies get distorted and changed in lots and lots of ways that end up injuring Native American populations. Things like the government officials out west who are supposed to help them make this transition, making sure that those officials themselves get the good slices of land and the Native Americans don't. So he cares deeply about this, although he is in the end unable to make as much of a difference on the policy side as he would have liked to.
He's a Democrat. He represents what was at one time the slavocracy, the Confederacy.
Yeah.
The Solid South is a major part of his success in 1884 and again in 1892. How did he treat the segregationists in his party? What did he make of them because of their arrogance?
The way that he fits in relationship to that strain of the party is a little difficult for us to understand in the modern era because it doesn't really satisfy any of our pre-existing mental categories, by which I mean Cleveland comes to office, the first Democrat elected after the Civil War. So there are concerns in parts of the country, especially amongst the freedmen, that this could mean we're going back to slavery. Those kind of rumors are running around the country. And Cleveland goes out of his way in his inaugural address to make plain that Black citizenship is an immutable fact of American life and that they are not going back. He does things in his personal capacity in the White House along these lines too that make him unpopular within the Democratic Party, such as having Frederick Douglass, at the time with Frederick Douglass's white wife, over to the White House for social occasions with some regularity, angers a lot of other Democrats. But once again, when it comes to the actual policy, Cleveland falls short here. Cleveland opposes the Republican efforts, this is especially going into his third election in 1892, to interpose the federal government in the South to rectify the problem of Blacks not having the right to vote. And I should say that there is no evidence that any of this is driven by racial animus. You don't really see a bigoted bone in his body at any point in his life, even though he's not what we would consider today a thoroughgoing racial egalitarian. It comes from this deep and immovable sense of constitutionalism. He cannot get his head around the idea that the only solution to this would be to invade the rights that rightfully belong to the states under the 10th Amendment to conduct their elections the way that they would want. The
Chinese Exclusion Act, the protectionism is part of it, but the Chinese were badly treated, especially because they were working some of the most dangerous jobs, the Union Pacific, the mining.
That's right.
What is his opinion of the way that the Congress treats the Chinese? Represent a lot of Asians who are coming to America at this time. What is his opinion of those bills?
You know, this is interesting. This is another area where his position would make nobody in the modern context satisfied, by which I mean, so he inherits the Chinese Exclusion Act. That happens in the Arthur administration. But they get even more restrictive in the Cleveland administration, mostly in terms of not letting people who had been in the U.S. and gone back home return to the U.S. And the reason for this, there's a lot of violence towards Chinese workers, especially there's a terrible massacre in Wyoming, which I chronicle in the book, in which Cleveland sends in federal troops. He is outraged, actually, by the fact that racial prejudice seems to be driving these attacks. But he nevertheless comes to the conclusion that the tensions, the racial tensions that exist with this immigrant community are beyond his capacity to rectify. So in the small universe of difference that he can make, he thinks, okay, we probably actually have to separate out these immigrant communities. We have to actually restrict the flow in, because what we have seen over and over again is that it results in violence. So he is simultaneously abhorring the racism that's driving this, but also coming to the conclusion that really all we can do here is restrict the inflow because it leads to so much tension and it leads to so much violence.
Bimetallism. It's time to turn to a policy that is an antique. At the same time, it makes sense. The silver wing of the Republican and Democratic Party, because it wasn't straight up partisanship and the gold wing. Can we explain it quickly, Troy?
Yeah, we can. The country was on the gold standard at this point. There had been a limited use of silver added to the money supply. And really all the layperson needs to understand about this is that the push for silver was largely driven by a concern that people, particularly in the South and the West, had amassed so much debt in moving out to the frontier that silver, because it would have an inflationary effect, would have the practical consequence of reducing the felt burden of that debt. And those are really the terms on which this debate is happening as a political matter. If you are pushing for more silver, it is usually because you are pushing to lessen rather the debt burden of people on the frontier or in the South.
And that will stain the re-election bid because his party is not entirely supportive of him anymore. He doesn't see, as the party does, that a part of the party, that if you can pay your debts with a silver dollar, though it's worth 85% of a gold dollar, or maybe 72%, it bounces back and forth.
Right.
It will ease your debt burden. That, of course, is instability, which to a classical liberal is a fire alarm. Do I say that correctly, Troy?
You do. And as I mentioned in the book, too, I think because he is a lawyer, the thing that is so inflammatory to him about this is that if you are changing the terms in which everything is denominated, you are changing the terms of every long-term contract in the country. And for a classical liberal and a lawyer, that is something he just can't get his head around.
I celebrate him for a small piece of the first term. This is his attempt to regulate nature and what we would call ecology today, the National Forest Reserve. It's not Yellowstone yet, but it's headed that way. The reason I mention this in particular, there's so many weighty issues here in that first term. It really is the challenge of America over the next century or more. Into the 21st century, these issues can't be resolved. But the massacre of wildlife out west, Troy, when you see the scale of it, you puzzle to yourself. And he was thinking as a hunter and as a fisherman that this needs to be preserved. Did he write extensively about it?
He didn't write extensively about it, partially because he didn't write extensively about anything. But the only book that we have in his hand was a book that he wrote about his hunting and fishing pastimes. And in that book, it is really the pastimes qua pastimes. He is not talking about their implications for policy like this, except there is a passage, which I quote in my book, where he says that anybody who is animated by the true spirit of sportsmanship when you're hunting or fishing understands that you have to carefully self-regulate. It can't be this wanton destruction of wildlife. And that is one of the things that motivates this sort of conservationist spirit that we see in him. It's a minor theme throughout his administration, but it does remind us that this goes back a little further than Theodore Roosevelt, which is where most people usually start that story.
I'm glad you mentioned Roosevelt because he's coming back, but there's a moment in the governor's mansion in Albany when Roosevelt wants a bill passed and Grover Cleveland rebukes him. How does he do it? It's quite spectacular, Troy.
Cleveland, who actually agreed with the substance of this bill, just Roosevelt had drafted it sloppily, and Cleveland's a good lawyer, so he can't have that, told him he was going to veto it, and Cleveland brings his fist down. This was a signature move of his, brings his fist down and pounds his desk, informs him, Mr. Roosevelt, I will veto this bill. And Roosevelt is recorded to have fallen backwards in his chair. I think fair to say that there are not many people who could have gotten that reaction out of Teddy Roosevelt. And one of Cleveland's staffers records that every time he sees these two go back and forth, it's a friendly relationship, generally speaking, but that he can't help but think of a great mastiff and a little terrier.
Every great man grows up with a great man in his imagination he wants to please. And your book reveals to me that I believe Teddy Roosevelt wanted to please Grover Cleveland.
I think there's something to that.
That explains a deal of his, what we now call ecology. The question of silver and gold will come back. However, the defeat is a surprise. He is defeated by a man he respects, however, Benjamin Harrison. What do we need to know about this defeat, Troy?
Well, you need to know that it's close, for one thing. As you mentioned, Cleveland wins the popular vote here. This is really decided by two states, Indiana and New York, and the margins were very small. That's point one. Point two that you probably need to know is that there were allegations that this election was stolen from Grover Cleveland because of the margins. Amongst the people who did not believe that was Grover Cleveland, who, when asked what he thought had happened, said, "I think the other party got the most votes." He was not willing to entertain this. And the third thing you need to know is that Cleveland really did himself in here in some sense, by which I mean he decided to build his entire reelection campaign around the issue of tariff reduction. Deeply felt, this was a principle that was part of both of his administrations, but a deep political miscalculation because, as you suggested earlier with the monetary policy issue, this issue did not unite his party. So the idea of going into a presidential reelection, building the entire thing around an issue that splits your party down the middle, not the best political strategy in the world, to such an extent that we know that the men who managed Grover Cleveland's campaign were not terribly disappointed that he lost. That's how divisive it was within the party.
The book is A Man of Iron, The Turbulent Life and Improbable Presidency of Grover Cleveland. Troy Senik is the author. Grover Cleveland entered the White House as a bachelor, lifelong bachelor, 48 years old. However, he was a man who had spent his life in pursuit of discipline, of hard work. He never actually relaxed as far as his compatriots could understand. He worked till 2 a.m., 3 a.m. until he was persuaded by the widow of and the daughter of a man who was a good friend of his named Oscar in Buffalo. He took upon the role of protecting this family and its finances after Oscar died. And the daughter, when he became the effective executor of the estate, was 11 years old, and her name is Frances. However, by the time he was in the White House, and importantly, the spring of 1885 in the White House, Frances was a major feature of his life. Frances is the most celebrated first lady that we have in the 19th century. It's amazing. And Troy, I did not know about her. It's a revelation and a half how she was so popular with the American people. They were actually willing to forgive Grover his excesses.
That's very true. I mean, Grover Cleveland, we should say this about him. Grover Cleveland comes to the White House respected because of this sort of iron will that he displays in Buffalo and New York State, and then in the White House. He doesn't necessarily come to it loved, however. This is not the world's most accessible personality. So when he marries Frances, very young, she's in her early 20s, very beautiful. There's a picture in the book that gives you a good sense of this, and this is all that is talked about at the time, is this beautiful young woman. I have these excerpts presented in the book of this very purple prose about how lovely Frances is being compared to these sort of Greek goddesses. But she also has this winning personality. She is the one who is front and center at the White House receptions, wants to meet everybody, even the shop girls that she's told she shouldn't be socializing with as first lady. There is a warmth and a sweetness to Frances Cleveland that the country really responds to. And so what does this mean in practical terms? Well, she's sort of Jackie Kennedy before you get Jackie Kennedy. She is everywhere in the press. The press, by the way, will make up stories about her because they know that it's good for newspaper sales. So there's a famous instance in which a journalist in Atlanta, if I recall correctly, writes a story that Frances Cleveland has abandoned the bustle. And the sales of bustles across the country collapses because she is such a trendsetter. Turns out this whole thing is made up. She ends up abandoning the bustle afterwards because it's sort of expected of her. But to give you just a sense, Grover Cleveland, late in his first term, does a tour throughout the country. And there is an account, I believe it was at one of the Midwestern stops. The specific one eludes me now, but it's representative of the tone. A reporter who says, there are thousands of men across the country just as qualified to be president as Grover Cleveland, but there's only one person who could be first lady like Frances.
This celebration includes the fact that he, having spent so many decades as a bachelor, is extremely moved by children. we've mentioned how he took care of his siblings after his father's death and his mother, his dutifulness, but at the same time, he was charmed. So this ice mountain of a man is persuaded by Francis that they need a large family, and eventually they will have one. The first child is born, I believe, when he's out of office. My note here, correct me, Troy, if I get this wrong, 1891, Ruth is born.
That's right.
And he is visibly moved. You report how he responded to his friends after her birth.
Yeah, he sends a letter to a friend in which, and I'm paraphrasing him here, but he sort of conveys that everything that has come before that, this is a man who's a former president of the United States, seems immaterial in light of having this daughter. And they will end up having a total of 5 children, 3 girls and 2 boys. Some of them coming after his second term. And Grover Cleveland has his last son in his mid-60s. And tragically, they lose his oldest. They lose Ruth, the oldest daughter, in his post-presidency. She dies quite young. She's 11 or 12 when she passes. And that was something that, as you would expect, but that was something that deeply shakes Cleveland, because he does have this other side to his personality, not often seen by the public, but he cares deeply about his family, he cares deeply about his children and children in general. He is one of these people. He can be icy with his contemporaries and his colleagues, but this is a soft spot for Grover.
The detail also about Grover Cleveland in the interregnum, as you entitle your chapter, is that he's not unhappy being a former president. He believes he acquit himself well, and he'll stand up to whatever else has come. So he doesn't spend 4 years plotting to return to the White House, is my reading. Is that correct, Troy?
Yeah, not at all. I mean, he's a strange figure in the history of the American presidency, because he never seems to have a deep, burning ambition for the presidency. But even once he's had it, the first 2 years out of office, I quote him multiple times saying, as you suggest, I think I did a pretty good job. I don't really have a burning desire to go back. He complains about it in the way a lot of former presidents complain about it. It was a lot. It's more than any person can do. And he doesn't really even get drugged back into the fray out of ambition per se. He gets drugged back in for 2 reasons. One is watching the Harrison administration undo a lot of the things that he did. And the other is his fear that this populist contingent in the Democratic Party, particularly on the bimetallism question, is going to take over. Those are the things that actually motivate him to get back into the fight.
In other words, policy. The return of Grover Cleveland ahead of us. Troy Senik is the author of the book, A Man of Iron, The Turbulent Life and Improbable Presidency of Grover Cleveland. It is 1892. The election at the end of the year calls forth candidates from both parties. Benjamin Harrison is a sitting president, but that doesn't make him exempt from being challenged by his side. There's a man named Blaine, James G. Blaine, 3rd Congressional District of Maine, then becomes Speaker of the House, then becomes Senator of Maine, then becomes Senator from the railroads. A man whom Grover Cleveland defeated in 1884, the first run for the presidency. There's a colorful story about a pastor named Burchard, a Presbyterian pastor, just like Grover Cleveland's dad, who makes a remark, rum Romanism and rebellion, to condemn the Democratic Party right before the election. That may or may not have persuaded enough votes, who can tell? But in any event, James D. Blaine is all wrapped up in being defeated in 84. And nobody believes him that he's not running again in 92. I mentioned Blaine because he represents the era, the Gilded Age. And Troy, your book is a wonderful antidote to the Gilded Age, because we can celebrate what you'd have to say is unregulated capitalism, yes, but at the same time, the public wanted someone to challenge these men growing rich and what you identify as the widening gap between the employers and the employed. So as Cleveland thought about the presidency in 92, as people made entreaties to him, will you run again, Mr. President? What did he make of Blaine, of the Gilded Age, of Jay Gould, of the man who will be Morgan, all of the rich men? What was his opinion?
Cleveland is interesting on this front because he is not crusading against corporate power. He is not somebody who is disturbed by the existence of wealth in and of itself, that gets to him down in his bones. But he has this sort of night watchman sensibility about this. You can go and make your fortune, but we're gonna watch you, and we need to see where this is coming from. And Cleveland, in sort of keeping with his classical liberal roots, and this makes him again sort of confusing because it doesn't fit cleanly into any sort of modern ideology. He's a free market guy. He wants to see people succeed. He wants the government to keep a light touch on the economy, but he is concerned about income inequality. And he locates the root of the problem, at least the problem that he feels it's appropriate for him to address as president of the United States, in the intersection between corporate power and government power. So as I mentioned earlier, with the tariffs, this is his real concern, that these companies are using Congress to get them what they need to inflate their balance sheets. But, he is the first president, for instance, to propose a federal role in labor arbitration. So he does think that the government has a role to support the working man, such as they were. But he is not driven with the same sort of passion on this as a lot of the burgeoning populists are.
At the same time, he, as a classical liberal, is witnessing what we would call today price instability, inflation and deflation. Does he opine about that as he's being romanced by the party to run again?
This is one of the most difficult things about Cleveland's return to understand, because it is a vestige of an era where the rules were so much different. So the ascendant wing of the Democratic Party at this point in time is the side that is supporting the expansion of silver. And Cleveland actually puts his toe back in the water by writing an open letter denouncing that position. Now, today, if a presidential candidate made his big opening move by defying the ascendant wing of the party, you would rightly consider that person to have just taken a step tantamount to political suicide. The reason that's not what happens to Cleveland is in 1892, we are still in the era prior to the presidential primary. These decisions are still made by party elites, by party insiders. And they look around in 1892. By the way, they weren't always that fond of Grover Cleveland because he rocked the boat a lot, but they look around in 1892 and say, well, he may be a pain sometimes, but this seems like a guy who is not going to pull apart the edifice of the American economy for fun. And he seems like the most stable choice that we have at this point. So this is a central part in the end of how he gets the nomination and returns in 1892.
Yes, and Harrison will run again. He'll choose Whitelaw Reid, a former editor of the Tribune, as his vice presidency. Notably, James G. Blaine does not run, but James G. Blaine represents a common understanding of what Senate can do in these days and what the Congress can do. And there's a tension here that perhaps remains important in our 21st century. And I want to draw on it, Troy, because so much of your book, I thought, well, that's where that comes from. The country was comfortable with using the Congress as their viceroys and not going to the president at the time. But there were critics of using the Congress as the lead and one of those critics was Woodrow Wilson, representing in his PhD in, I believe it was 1880, congressional democracy, congressional leadership, denying it, saying the president has a role here. Did Cleveland enter into those arguments? Because they were using how he thought about the presidency as a way of seeing another way. Did he write about Congress has too much power? James T. Blaine had too much power as a senator, and he had too much power as a Secretary of State, and now he's going to have too much power as a former member of Congress.
No, quite the contrary. Particularly in his first term, Cleveland goes out of his way in a fashion that drives some of his fellow Democrats crazy to say, I don't have a role on a lot of these questions. My conception of the executive is sufficiently narrow that, look, a thing comes to my desk and I sign it or I veto it. And that's where the job stops, and that's where the job starts. He implicitly, he never really hoists a flag about this, but in the second term, adopts a somewhat more aggressive posture, but it's mostly in the use of executive power in sort of outside settings. For instance, when he sends federal troops to Chicago for the Pullman strike, it's not as much in the relationship with Congress. Cleveland is actually quite content most of the time. I mean, there will be some light political pressure applied, light by our current standards, to members of Congress. But beyond that, he is not thinking of it as a big structural system-wide imbalance.
How have I got this far and not mentioned Tammany Hall? Good heavens. Okay, so immediately in the summer of 92, before, at the time he's contesting for the nomination, there are other possibilities, including the former governor, now Governor Senator Hill of New York, a man who is sympathetic, if not owned by Tammany Hall. Cleveland is not, nor will he make promises to Richard Kroger, to William Shaheen, to Charles Francis Murray. These are the big bosses of Tammany Hall. What does Tammany Hall make of Cleveland? Do they think they can use him?
Tammany Hall regards Cleveland from pretty much the moment he comes on their radar, which is really when he runs for governor of New York. They regard him as an pure and utter thorn in their side, because Cleveland, not only is Cleveland unwilling to play ball the way that Tammany usually plays ball, right? Which is making sure that the Tammany men get the jobs in the right places, that policy moves in such a way that Tammany is always benefiting from it. But also Cleveland, even when the stakes are relatively low, when a more canny politician may just give Tammany the low stakes thing that they want, so I don't have to fight them on the high side, Cleveland won't do it because he is so cussed when it comes to principle. So Tammany really is fatigued by him and plagued by him. They, throughout his tenure, are at war with him. And of course, he annoys them just as much as president, even though he's outside of the New York context, because Tammany has its finger in all these pies of people that they want to get federal jobs. Cleveland still won't play ball. So they are at war pretty much his entire career.
Cleveland wins the election in November of 92. 277 electoral votes versus 145 for President Harrison. One of, if not the only time, two men who have been president run against each other. Someone has to lose. There's a factor here, the People's Party. James B. Weaver runs as a candidate for this third party that wins 22 electoral votes. That's what we remember as populism, and that's what we remember as a man named Bryan, but that's in the future. When we come back, Cleveland confronts the panic of 93 and the disruption of inflation and deflation. A man of iron, the turbulent life and improbable presidency of Grover Cleveland, 22nd and now 24th president of the United States. It's the spring of 1893. There's a panic, what we call a recession, onto a depression. What drives it, Troy? Where does it begin?
At the risk of oversimplifying, because this is a complicated issue, but complicated in a way that will bore your audience to tears, too in depth about it, this goes back to the same conversation that we were having about bimetallism. There's an injection of silver into the economy. And really what you see in the Panic of 1893, which is referred to in its day, by the way, as the Great Depression. This is the biggest depression the country has seen up to that point, is an instability, and an instability that plagues the country for years. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that the country, being on the gold standard, is obliged to keep a certain amount of gold in the bank at all times. But as you mentioned earlier, part of the problem here is that you've got gold and silver in the market at the same time, and they're not worth the same amount. So anybody in this set of circumstances is going to be hoarding the gold, which is the more valuable of the two metals. And that's what happens. You see gold being pulled from the market at the same time that the federal government is trying to hold on to gold in order to convince the world, and especially the financial class in the country, we're staying on the gold standard. The reason that this uncertainty lingers for so long, and Cleveland is engaged in a lot of triage throughout his administration, which eventually staunches the bleeding, but we never get to full recovery until the McKinley administration afterwards, is because this tension runs through the middle of the Democratic Party. So the financial markets can never calm down because they never know whether the gold or the silver side is going to be the one that wins out. All Cleveland really is able to do is put his finger in the dike, and keep it from totally breaking. And that's why it'll fall to McKinley before this all gets solved.
There's a cascade that begins with the failure of what is called the National Cordage Company. Didn't know that was important, did you? Well, as a matter of fact, it makes rope. And it had paid 100% dividend right before that, but suddenly they have to reorganize. And then it hits the banks call loans, South and West banks fail. You can see this as a prelude for what we know as serial deep recessions, depressions over the next 100 years. And not exempting the 21st century, not exempting any moment. And at the same time, Cleveland is taking on protectionism, tariff reform. There's a new concept called free trade, which I think we could put Cleveland on the free trade side. And there's also an attempt to gather money with a nominal income tax, making Cleveland, who thought he was the meanest man in the world for the first term, doubly the meanest man in the world. Right next to Beelzebub, but it didn't bother him anymore. Is that correct, Troy?
On the income tax question?
No, on being disregarded by his own party, by everybody, because he wants to just change everything.
Yeah, I mean, what you really see with Cleveland in relation to the Democratic Party is by the time you get into the middle of the second term, he has already become sort of yesterday's man. They have really moved beyond him. There are divisions in the party on tariffs. There are divisions in the party on monetary policy, on silver. And Cleveland ends up, in the last few years of his administration, one of his clerks records that by the end, he is getting about as much mail as a normal businessman. I mean, people have just forgotten about the president. They have mentally moved on from him. And you mentioned Bryan earlier. By the time Cleveland leaves office, I mean, Bryan will be the party's nominee in 1896, then again in 1900, then again in 1908. And this is all a rebuke to Cleveland. I mean, Cleveland disliked Bryan about as much as he disliked any politician because he thought that he was betraying the true faith of the Democratic Party. And by the time that 1895, 1896 rolls around, no one cares what Grover Cleveland thinks within the Democratic Party. They regard him as a failure. They regard him as superannuated. They're moving on. They're becoming more populist.
This is the Gilded Age. This is when extremely well-to-do men like George Pullman will vouchsafe the firing into crowds by federal troops and call it law and order. This is the Gilded Age when men like Eugene Debs are threatened and jailed because they stand up for the unions that represent the working man. This is the Gilded Age of all of that violence and cost and deal making all the time. At the same time, this is the Gilded Age of early cancer surgery. And I found a place here to mention in a few minutes an episode that takes place in the summer of 1894. It is in the springtime that Francis is asked by Grover Cleveland, what's this sore in the upper part of my mouth? What is that sore, Troy?
That sore turns out to be a form of cancer. And cancer at the time is something that is only spoken of in euphemism in America because it is regarded as so daunting a prospect and almost always fatal. And on top of this, the country had just recently seen Ulysses S. Grant wither away and die as a result of his throat cancer. And this is all happening in the midst of a financial crisis. So you can imagine the shockwaves that would have gone through the country if they had known that Grover Cleveland had a potentially fatal case of cancer in the midst of all of this, which is why this ends up resulting in a secret surgery conducted at sea under pretty brutal conditions, certainly brutal by comparison to modern standards. And this is successfully, first of all, the surgery itself is successful, but it is also successfully kept from the country for years. One journalist gets this story, is derided by Cleveland allies in the press, and is only years later, after Cleveland is dead, that his wife, Frances, by then his widow, gives permission for one of the doctors involved to come forward and say, that report that came out back in the 1890s, it turns out it was substantially right. This is what happened. And it was kept from the American public.
Do they tell the vice president, Adlai Stevenson? Who is the grandfather, I believe, of Adlai Stevenson of 52 and 56.
That's exactly right. He is the grandfather. No, they not only do they not tell him about the surgery, he doesn't know the president is sick. It's a real testament to the way that the vice presidency was handled in the 19th century. And Cleveland was very nervous as regards Stevenson because they were on opposite sides of the monetary question. So had he expired in the course of this, the country could have gone in a very different direction. The Panic of 1893 could have gone in a very different direction.
Verrucous carcinoma. I hope I don't badly pronounce that too much.
You got it.
A biopsy or a test on it because they kept, for some reason, the College of Surgeons kept this piece of surgery taken out of the president's mouth. What was it? Would it have killed him? We have about 30 seconds.
It would potentially have killed him, but not in the way that one would think. This is a very rare form of cancer that doesn't really metastasize. It would have most likely threatened his life by growing so large that it would have obstructed his airways. He did not know this at the time. We only discovered this years and years, decades really, after his death.
The book is A Man of Iron, The Turbulent Life and Improbable Presidency of Grover Cleveland. Heretofore, we've concentrated on what we call domestic politics, price stability, inflation, deflation, and there's national deflation in that second term that is far more alarming than the inflation they thought they were dealing with. However, there's also the contest over what Mark Twain will call imperialism. Imperialism will show itself again and again in the Spanish War at the end of this decade under McKinley and Teddy Roosevelt. But it begins with episodes, as far as I can understand, in Cleveland's time, over 3 far-flung pieces of real estate. We'll begin with the story of Nicaragua. They're looking for what will eventually become the Panama Canal. How does Cleveland acquit himself when it comes to the question of the adventurism in Nicaragua?
He can't bring himself to support it. This is something that he inherits from the Arthur administration. There's a treaty to build something similar, if not precisely the same, as what becomes the Panama Canal across Nicaragua. And it's important to understand why he can't abide it. He actually likes the idea. He understands the inherent value of a transoceanic canal. The reason he can't sign off on it is because the terms of this agreement would lead Nicaragua to be an American protectorate. And Cleveland does not think that the wisdom of the founding fathers on foreign policy needs any updating. So to his mind, anything that implicates the United States in a permanent relation with an international power, where we would have that kind of responsibility for Nicaragua, he can't abide. So this is the reason that he leaves that treaty behind, and that we end up having to wait a few decades until we get this transoceanic canal and, of course, the huge change that it ends up precipitating.
And the challenge of foreign policy for Cleveland, given that he sees his role as delimited from what we understand today, does he believe that he has a free hand in it without Congress interfering? Does he follow the idea of the Monroe Doctrine is his to enforce?
Well, it depends on which issue you're talking about. He definitely thinks he has a freer hand on foreign policy than he does on domestic issues. But there are instances in his presidency where he comes up to a line, for instance, with Hawaii, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a moment, where he says, this is on Congress now. I have gone to the extent that my powers will allow. But he is quite aggressive in defending the Monroe Doctrine. And this is the case, most notably in a case in his second term in Venezuela, where there is a border dispute with Britain. And Britain is consistently defining the borders of its imperial possessions there wider and wider and wider, to the point where the Cleveland administration takes the position that, well, this is a de facto violation of the Monroe Doctrine. You are expanding your claims so broadly that essentially constitutes a new claim. And this leads to a lot of diplomatic tensions between the U.S. and Britain, almost boiling over to the point where people are concerned about war. Britain then gets distracted by some other foreign challenges in Europe. And at the end of the day, this all ends up going to arbitration. But it is part and parcel with what you see in the second term, which is a little bit more aggressive stance from Cleveland on these foreign policy questions.
He doesn't really have an army and a navy to project power as we understand it in the 21st century. In fact, wasn't the Secretary of the Navy under the first administration so ill-informed that he resigned after he was challenged by the Secretary of the Treasury? It's a whopper of a story. Can you help me remember it, Troy?
It's the story is right. The players are slightly off. So it is an assistant secretary, but it is the secretary doing the challenging. When Cleveland's Navy secretary comes in the first term, actually, I take it back. I don't think it was an assistant secretary. I think it was even more junior than that. His secretary comes in very concerned about the state of the Navy. In fact, there's a lot of work done in both Cleveland administrations to start creating a modern Navy. And one of the things that they're concerned about is that there's just a lot of layabout, spoil system employees there. And so Cleveland's Navy secretary masters the details sufficiently that when his junior employees can't answer his questions, that's when you get to this story, the one who is so humiliated by the fact that he can't respond properly, that he then turns around and resigns.
You mentioned Venezuela. This has to do with the conflict with England, with Great Britain, but it is in general the conflict with Europe at the time that dominates the story. There's another instance where Bismarck has taken possession of Samoa. This is the colonial outreach into the Pacific that still very much influences our decision-making about Oceania, this vast conference. Did Cleveland, who didn't travel as president, I understand, did he regard the German militarism or the English presumptiveness or the European powers, did he regard them as a threat to the United States as they colonized Africa, as they colonized the Pacific?
Not directly to what we now call the homeland of the United States, but he is just as forceful about foreign countries not making incursions into these places as he is to the United States not making incursions in them. So the situation in Samoa, which actually happens in the first term, there was what they call a tripartite protectorate. The US, the UK, and Germany all had a peace there. And the Germans start moving at this point to essentially overthrow the monarchy and move the country in a direction that is much more German inflected. And this is the most aggressive military leadership in Cleveland's two terms. He actually sends American warships over there. The Germans eventually back off, but he has no truck with that kind of intrusion in these affairs of foreign countries, in the same way that he does not want the United States to be doing it in foreign countries.
Yes, and now the United States does it. That's what's so striking. We come to the 50th state, Hawaii.
Yeah.
And the chronology here is a disgrace, and Cleveland felt it. He regarded the whole thing as shameful. It's very quickly what happens is that the Hawaiian Islands are dominated by American planters. Much of it is owned. And the Hawaiian kingdom, which will pass from a king to a queen, resents and refutes the American domination. Cleveland is president during the time of this confrontation, and yet he can't stop it. Is that the way we regard this, Troy?
Yeah, more or less. He inherits this. So when this uprising happens in Hawaii that overthrows the monarchy, it happens with the assent of the American ambassador. But this is the American ambassador in the Harrison administration. This is the dying days of Benjamin Harrison's presidency before Cleveland returns to office. We should note, it does not happen with the explicit endorsement of the Harrison administration, because in that day and age, these people were so far removed from Washington that you could get away with an awful lot without Washington having, their thumb on the scales. Cleveland is, as you say, is horrified by this. This is to him entirely counter to what the United States of America is about. The idea that we would play a role in the overthrow of a sovereign government out in the middle of the Pacific. But the reason that he is unable to do much about it is that too much time has passed. The queen has been overthrown. The new government has taken over. Cleveland sends diplomatic representatives to try to work out an accommodation. It's just as simple as the new government will not deal. So the only thing that the United States could do at that point would be to send military forces to Hawaii to restore the status quo ante. Well, Congress is not as upset about it as Cleveland is, and Cleveland can't do this without Congress. So he writes a very touching, very beautiful, and very pained letter to Congress explaining his unhappiness with all of this and his disappointment at some level with the country for being party to this. But it is ultimately Congress's decision, and they do nothing. So this government exists independently in Hawaii for a few years, and then the U.S. ends up annexing it a few years later under the McKinley administration, partially on a strategic justification during the Spanish-American War.
And that record, as you unearth it to me in your telling, is highly, highly shameful, highly shameful. The planters stole Hawaii from the people who lived there. And there was, to my reading, there was no compensation. Is that correct, Troy? We didn't pay them.
That's correct. And also a more restrictive form of government. The voting rights were curtailed for people who had had voting rights under the Hawaiian system. It's not necessarily the case that the monarchy was perfect. The monarchy was illiberal in a lot of respects and inefficient in many respects, but it was still Hawaii's government. And the United States, at least under cover of our ambassador at the time, interposed itself here in a way that, as we now know, would never be reversed.
And you see how the foreshadowing here of what will be the Spanish-American War and the grab of a piece of Cuba that we have today, Guantanamo, and the Philippines protectorate, all of that is established as how to do it during Cleveland's second term, and McKinley and Roosevelt will follow on accordingly. We're going to turn to Cleveland after the presidency next, because it's both moving and revelatory of how future presidents learn from Grover Cleveland. The book is A Man of Iron, The Turbulent Life and Improbable Presidency of Grover Cleveland. He leaves office in the election of 1896, a man whom Cleveland celebrates, McKinley, becomes president of the United States. Teddy Roosevelt is in the future now. Teddy Roosevelt doesn't become vice president until the second term for McKinley. Cleveland and Francis, with their 2 children, I believe at this point, maybe more, leave Washington, and they move to Princeton, New Jersey. And the president becomes involved with Princeton University at the time that a young professor is startling everybody with his genius and drive, named Woodrow Wilson. What do we know about the relationship between Wilson, the future president, and Grover Cleveland, the former president?
They have a relationship that I think we can describe as friendly without necessarily being friends. Wilson, in his capacity as a scholar, had actually been quite positive on Cleveland, probably the best contemporary record of the Cleveland presidency and contemporary analysis was written by Woodrow Wilson in The Atlantic. Wilson praises Cleveland in his post-presidency as roughly the kind of president the founders probably had in mind. And what he meant by that is independent, seeing himself as an independent power center from the Congress and a check on Congress. But there is a bit of conflict in the future here, because Wilson will become the president of Princeton. Cleveland is eventually on the board. And the event that actually precipitates Wilson leaving academia and going into politics is what seems to us a very small board dispute over the proper location of the graduate campus then to be built at Princeton. Wilson and Cleveland are on opposite sides of this question. And we don't have a lot of closed-door records of what happened, but we know that there were some fairly icy exchanges, most of the ice coming from the Wilson side. And so in a weird way, Grover Cleveland is partially responsible for the events that precipitate Woodrow Wilson, the politician, and following that, Woodrow Wilson, the president of the United States.
And Grover Cleveland and Teddy Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt becomes, his accidency is how he's called, because McKinley is assassinated in Buffalo in 1901, and Roosevelt becomes president immediately. Did he have correspondence with Grover Cleveland? Did they meet in a formal affairs? Did they have a relationship?
Yeah, there are instances of Cleveland and Roosevelt writing back and forth. Cleveland at one point offering to help Roosevelt in a labor dispute, but probably the most interesting interaction between them at this time is one that we don't have a complete record of, because Roosevelt is recorded as having told Francis that the nicest thing anybody said to him upon taking the presidency came from Grover Cleveland. We don't know what was said, but Roosevelt records it as being the equivalent of a senior putting his hand over a freshman's shoulder, telling him everything's going to be all right. It's not the sort of sentimentality that we normally associate with Grover Cleveland, but these men had a relationship running back years, running over many different venues. And you saw that in the moments when Roosevelt became president.
Troy's book is a gift because Cleveland did not write memoir, did not write an autobiography. Why not, Troy? Can we puzzle it together?
Well, yeah, because he left us some testimony as to why. He was asked about this in his post-presidency, and his initial reaction for the first few years was, I don't think anybody wants to hear from me. I don't know that I have anything to say. He eventually gets more and more tempted by it, and we come really close, actually, to an oral history project, which would have doubled as one. And then the offer falls through. And Cleveland, because he's not driven by the sort of megalomania that we sort of associate with these modern politicians, says to his friends, well, it's probably fine. He said, my autobiography is written on the hearts of my friends and my family, and they can look at it whenever they want. It's a sweet sentiment, and it tells you something about the fundamental humility of the man, but no question that it has been damaging to him in terms of what we would call presidential legacy, a term that would be entirely foreign to him. But he did not have that eye that modern politicians often have on the furthest horizon. What will people think long after I'm gone? I'm not sure that he would have cared if you had asked him.
Several children are born to them in Princeton, and they lose Ruth, which breaks his heart. You've mentioned it earlier. And I want to make note, if you visit Cleveland's grave in Princeton, he's buried next to Ruth. Very significant to him. Francis will remarry, but I want to stay after the president's death some years later. I want to stay with what you've achieved in piecing this together, because Cleveland seems to be distributed widely, the memoirs of Cleveland, and it's not easy to ascertain all of these resources. There has been a missing piece of American presidential history. Do we know why, Troy? All these years later, it's easy to find how Cleveland was anticipating the great policies of the 20th century.
Do we know?
Do we know why he's been overlooked?
Do we know why he's been overlooked? I think there's a couple of reasons. I think one is the one that I just mentioned, because Cleveland, of not having written a memoir, because Cleveland, if you look in the decades immediately after his presidency, when there are still people living with the memory of a Grover Cleveland administration, he actually ranks quite highly. In the 40s in the Schlesinger poll, he's number 8 all time. He's between John Adams and Teddy Roosevelt. But that dies off with that same generation who lived through it. That's point one. But point two, and this is one of the reasons that I wanted to write this book, this era that he inhabited is extremely foreign to us, more foreign than earlier ones. Most Americans understand the stakes around the Civil War. They understand the stakes around the founding era. But think about the issues we've just talked about: bimetallism, military pensions, tariffs, civil service reform. These all seem so antique. And so part of the rationale behind this book was not only to introduce people to Grover Cleveland, maybe for the first time, but to introduce them to the issues of this era and what they mean, how they analogize to the modern context. Because let's be honest, most people, when you're a high school student, for instance, you may get 2 days on this era in American history. And so much of it is so alien that it requires a little bit more analysis to really understand how it fits together in the American story and how figures like Grover Cleveland fit in to the American story.
He was understood as incorruptible. He was understood as strong-minded. He was understood as consistent. And a reader's response to all of your very careful work, and there are many quotations at length by Grover Cleveland writing about bills he agrees with or positions he will or will not take. he evidences that he'd only ever had offices where he could determine by himself without committee or consultation what is going to happen. And sometimes it was rejected by his legislature or the aldermans or the councils he was dealing with. Sometimes it was embraced. But he's not a man who learned to compromise early, which is what he would have if he'd risen through the ranks, say, as a member of Congress, or even before that, as a member of the Assembly in Albany. And so I don't know whether we could have a model like Grover Cleveland anymore. He seems quite out of time to me at times, Troy. He's not thinking ahead about how politically you achieve difficult stories by going with small bites, not big bites.
I think that's right. That he just seems like a sort of cryptid. He doesn't fit into the way that we think about politics now. And I think you're quite right to suggest that he, not only did he not have any legislative experience, hard to imagine him having any legislative experience, right? I mean, you see this occasionally with former governors who go into the Senate, and so many of them are so frustrated with it that they leave after a single term because there's just a different sensibility behind it. And Cleveland is a guy who has to be sort of driving the bus. And he says this in his retirement, that one of the things he does miss about office is the intellectual exertion, the feeling that he was doing something and had to be laboring for the country as a whole. That is really sort of fundamental to his character.
And Troy, your thoughts now about Cleveland as a president. Was he a success? Was he not? Were there things left undone that make you doubt him? What is your opinion after all this hard work? We have 30 seconds.
I say in the book that he was a great president, which doesn't necessarily mean he had a great presidency. And what I mean by that is a lot of his policy accomplishments were sort of half accomplishments. And on a lot of fronts, he failed. But precisely the thing that you identified, that sense of firmness, of character, of resolve, of incorruptibility, those are things that I think should be a touchstone for any American president. And by that measure, he is certainly a success.
Yes, Grover Cleveland versus the Gilded Age. Book is A Man of Iron. Cleveland Wins. The Turbulent Life and Improbable Presidency of Grover Cleveland. I highly recommend. Fill in the missing piece of a 20th century education with President Cleveland, the 22nd and 24th President of the United States. Troy Senik is the author. I'm John Batchelor.